Morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bernard Bailyn lecture for 2024. My name's Timothy Minchin, and I'm Professor of North American History at Trobe University. And it's great to see you all here today. I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on here at Trobe University in Bandora, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I know we've got many of you in different locations, so feel free to write your own acknowledgement in the chat. So the Bernard Bailyn lectures in North American history recognizes La Trobe University's traditional strength in North American history, which goes back to the university's foundation in the 1960s, when it was one of the first areas that the university specialized in. And in the 1990s, the lecture was established and named after a Harvard professor, colonial historian called Bernard Bailyn. So it's fitting today that we're able to have a Harvard scholar with us, Walter Johnson, who is Winthrop Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard. And Walter's work focuses on slavery, capitalism, and imperialism, mainly in the 19th century. He has his PhD from Princeton University and taught at New York University before moving to Harvard, and has had really a stellar career. Published his first book, Soul by Soul, Life Inside the Antebellum Slave Market in 1999, which won multiple awards, and used the slave market as a way to think about the fears and violence that characterize American society. And he also then followed up with another book called River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Imperialism in the Mississippi Valley in 2013, which is a history of the Mississippi Valley between the Louisiana Purchase and the Civil War. And then more recently, he's published about the history of St. Louis, which is his hometown. A book called The Broken Heart of America, St. Louis and the Violent History of the United States, that was published in 2020. And he's won multiple prizes, had multiple fellowships. And so we're very fortunate to have Walter here today to talk to us about racial capitalism, which I think is a topic that will interest many of us in both the US history, but also more broadly as well. So thank you to everyone. I'll hand over to you, Walter.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm sorry not to be there with you. I would have dearly loved to travel to Melbourne, but I'm glad to get to sit with you this way. I don't have any tech, and so I'm afraid that this is going to look like a nearly elderly person reading a paper in a room by himself, and so you'll have to just have to roll with that. The title of the paper is on racial capitalism, the logic of the broken plate, and this is sort of the second conceptual essay that I've written about racial capitalism. And it is an effort to both extend, amplify, and specify some of the arguments that I've made, both in the earlier piece that I wrote, which was published in the Boston Review some time ago, and in my books, particularly the book River of Dark Dreams about the lower Mississippi Valley, and then the book about St. Louis. To begin with, let us posit for the moment what seems obvious on the face of things, that our society, our world, has a racial order, an imperial order, and a capitalist order, and that those orders are organically related to one another, but not identical. That seems to me to be the lesson that W.E.B. Du Bois described in his essay, The Souls of White Folk, written in the aftermath of the First World War and the midst of the Red Scares and racial massacres in the post-war United States. The history of racial capitalism, the history by which Europe came, quote, to use black and brown men for all of the uses which men know, he wrote, began with empire and the slave trade. Europeans were not the first to use men for the benefit of their masters. That was a practice as old as the world. nor to conceive of the victims as different from the victors. That, too, was as old as mankind and the invention of no race or people. But the reduction of human difference to the bare question of color and the application of that racism on the scale of the globe, that was something new, something modern, the beginning of a new sort of time. Europe proposed to apply racist instrumentalization on a scale and with an elaborateness of detail of which no former world ever dreamed. The imperial width of the thing, its heaven-defying audacity, Marx, Du Bois said, its modern newness. In much contemporary historical and political thought, the idea of racial capitalism is interposed between two other ways of thinking about the long history of slavery and capitalism. On the one hand, the idea that American history is the idea of American history as a 400-year-long episode in the working out of the intellectual and cultural history of white supremacy. Afro-pessimism, and what Robin Kelly has called Afro-pessimism light. And on the other hand, the ortho-Marxism that takes any effort to understand the role of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, even those which are themselves, in essence, modes of extraction, dispossession, and exploitation, as a distraction from understanding the real underlying history of the modes of production and the contest of social classes for state power. So I'm outlining two alternative views, one that we could call the race-forward view and one that we could call the class-forward view. There is more than enough racism in our world to suggest why some would want to frame their politics around the imperatives of anti-racism and its liberal epigony, diversity, equality, and inclusion. Even for the descendants of the enslaved, the colonized, and the imperialized who have managed to make their way onto ivied campuses and into boardrooms and backrooms, there is the lingering and continual risk of being dragged back, called out, and beat down. Think of Henry Louis Gates Jr. brandishing his Harvard ID while being arrested on the front porch of his own home. Or think of Serena Williams nearly dying of a pulmonary embolism after being passively reassured by her healthcare provider that her shortness of breath, her sensation that she was dying, was simply a confused reaction to pain medication. And yet racial progress in our society has too often been figured as access to, quote, a seat at the table, without sufficient concern to the terms under which the table was to be built, set, served, and cleaned up. Indeed, an appreciable portion of the conflict over racial and other forms of justice and inclusion in our society has begun to take the form of an extended and increasingly baroque conversation about table manners, about the proper terms for discussing pressing injustice in elite institutions. At my own university, the bulk of the work of the DEI office during the academic year 2021-22 was the preparation, execution, and discussion of a, quote, climate survey seeking to gauge the level of interpersonal incivility across the various units of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. As important as civility, decency, and empathy are, they are poor proxies for justice in a society as unequal as our own, especially when they are being fostered within institutions literally invested in a set of gigantic hedges against justice and our common future, represented by the capitalist status quo, deeply reliant on the philanthropic surplus wrung by the super-rich from the rest of the world, and inextricable symbiosis with weapons research, defense contracting, and the murderous course of empire. One might ask if genuine civility, decency, or empathy are even possible within such institutions, or if they are only the barest sorts of enabling fictions. Indeed, the avidity with which the corporations and universities responded to the uprisings of 2020 with the institutionalization of a para-academic DEI bureaucracy suggests nothing so much as an almost calculated campaign of co-optation and containment. While the protests in the streets brought the question of revolutionary social change to the fore in the shape of calls for police and prison abolition, their radicalism was gradually reframed in corporate media retelling into a beguiling call for the transformation of existing institutions rather than their displacement, and initiatives focusing on individual improvement rather than social reconstruction. Even before the crowds had finished their march through the streets, a group of diversity entrepreneurs were bringing up the rear, advertising new books and corporate trainings, boiling the revolutionary calls for abolition down into a set of possibilities for personal transformation and multicultural understanding, securing the bag. No wonder that there are frustrated and critical people who insist on emphasizing the economic dimensions of the ongoing catastrophe that we call history. Our lives and aspirations are framed by endemic capitalist inequality, and so it makes sense that many would insist on grounding their politics in opposition to capitalist inequality over and above all or other forms of derogation, exclusion, and even identity-based violence. There are, after all, we are frequently reminded, many among the supposedly imperially and racially privileged who are themselves regularly subjected to the most grinding forms of economic exploitation. White people working mind-numbing shifts at dead-end jobs, doing time in prison for poor people's crimes, and getting shot by police. But the universal remedies that frame the horizon of politics for those who begin from the premise of the superordinate moral and political importance of the wrongs of class frequently turns out to be foreshortened by the ways that racial capitalism has already been built into the fabric of our world. I apologize for that sentence. We're told that universal health care coverage will cure a world where for-profit hospitals have abandoned inner cities. Healthcare providers routinely diminish African Americans' account of their symptoms. Comorbidities produced by social inequality serve as alibis for grotesque inequalities in death rates. And, quote, objective medical equipment, such as oximeters, produce racist misreadings. Or we are told that universal social prosperity will be produced by massive investment in a national infrastructure that is itself the product of decades of racial capitalism. Urban to suburban bypass routes built through and across Black neighborhoods. Cities organized around automobiles which are targeted and ticketed at vastly different rates according to who is driving them. Toxic byproducts distributed and dumped according to demonically precise correlation with the racial capitalist template of our everyday lives. Nor is it immediately clear how a one-size-fits-all expansion of the social warrant would address the atavistic and sadistic pleasures that operate in excess of the economic order of our society. Ida B. Wells long ago chronicled the economic and political motives that framed the history of lynching in the South. She demonstrated the ways that white mobs were instrumentalizing race hate to hoard opportunity and loot their Black competitors. But even as we have come to understand the material aspect of the mob, we have been left with a terrifying remainder: their joy, their slack-jawed wonder in the crowd photos they preserved as mementos, their arousal. Racist pleasure vastly in excess of any economic function. Public and psychological violence that was its own reward. With all that in mind, let us return to the question of racial capitalism. As W.E.B. Du Bois argued long ago, human agency emerges under specific rather than universal conditions. In the history of North America, those conditions were decisively shaped by slavery, settler colonialism, and overseas empire. In the history of the United States, writes Lisa Lowe, capital has maximized its profits, not through rendering labor abstract, but precisely through the social production of difference, marked by race, nation, geographical origin, and gender. Her point in saying so is to urge us towards an outline of the history of changing forms of dispossession and discipline, and the way that they depended upon and related to changing notions of difference. The development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society, Cedric Robinson writes, pursued essentially racial directions. So too did social ideology. As a material force, then, it could be expected that racialism would inevitably permeate the social structures emergent from capitalism. From the time of the slave trade and throughout the ongoing history of empire, economic progress has been imagined and enacted through racialization. There is an interesting and complicated debate among sociologists about whether or not capitalism is necessarily or contingently racial. For me, as a historian, answering this question in the once-and-for-all manner of a sociological model is less important than in tracing the incised patterns of racial capitalist development since the era of the slave trade and the expansion of European empire in the Americas. This is, after all, the only history that we have or will ever have. William Conroy, following Stuart Hall, has recently described the material history of racialization as, quote, a line of tendential force, a historical given, if not a sociological necessity, a past which prefigures the future of racial capitalist development. Du Bois described this as the logic of the broken plate, which seared of old across its pattern, cracks never again, save along the old destruction. So there's a repetition of the targeting. Once someone has been targeted, then investment or exploitation flow along that pattern of targeting. That's the essential argument of the paper. Du Bois provided a fuller account of the dynamic interdependence between modes of economic exploitation and regimes of racial domination in his essay on the Black Worker, the first chapter of Black Reconstruction. The book was written in the early years of the Great Depression, amidst the Hoovervilles, marches of the unemployed, and tentative alliances between poor and working-class Black people and the Communist Party of the United States. It should thus be understood as a mode of thinking that emerged out of a moment of danger, and one that sought to emphasize the necessity of interracial working-class alliances in the United States, and to understand their evident historical vexation. Black labor became, he wrote of the period of slavery, the foundation stone, not only of the Southern social structure, but of the Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. The emergence of this new global economy was simultaneously and dialectically the emergence of a new problem concerning racialization, the problem of the relation of Black and white labor. No matter how degraded the factory hand, Du Bois wrote, he is not real estate. This simple sentence called into question the entire architecture of both the classical and critical traditions of Western political economy. For it noted that in slavery, capital and labor encountered one another not in a factory, nor on opposite sides of a bargaining table, nor even at the locked gates of a shop shut down by striking workers, but as two spirits inhabiting one body. It was the racialized character of slavery that justified and formatted its particular form and practice, the things that could be done to and with enslaved people that could not be done to and with other workers. In this vital respect, this is Du Bois again, The slave laborer differed from all the others of his day. He could be sold. He could, at the will of a single individual, be transferred for life 1,000 miles or more. His family, wife, and children could be legally and absolutely taken from him. The black worker, racial capitalism. With Du Bois and Black Reconstruction, we begin the process that Cedric Robinson termed the renaming of things. And for Du Bois, the racial capitalism of slavery provided the template for social economic organization on a global scale, for empire. That dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all of Africa, in the West Indies and Central America and in the United States, that great majority of mankind on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry. Here, Du Bois wrote, is the modern labor problem. Out of the exploitation of the dark proletariat comes the surplus value filched from human beasts, which in cultured lands the machines and harness power veil and conceal. The emancipation of man is the emancipation of labor, and the emancipation of labor is the freeing of that basic majority of workers who are yellow, brown, and black. The history of racial capitalism is here presented as the global generalization of the logic of the broken plate. Accumulations along the pathways of history and conquest scored into the face of the globe. All of that said, Du Bois' unapologetically masculinist framing of the vulnerability of, quote, the black worker under the conditions of enslavement, he could be, his wife and children could be, calls for specification and elaboration. For it was the natal alienation of slavery upon which Du Bois relied when he distinguished the elementary aspects of slave and free labor, upon the reproductive invigilation that characterized every aspect of the lives of enslaved women, upon the foreordained expropriation of children as they passed out of their mothers' wombs and into the world, upon the way that black families were parsed from one another in a pattern that charts the lineage and inheritance of their white owners. The conjoined character of capital and labor in American slavery hung upon a reproductive hinge. We must, that is to say, attend to the varied character of the racialization and sexualization of human beings according to the varying modes and practices of accumulation, or, put more carefully, to the way that racial and sexual domination and capitalist exploitation structure one another. Slavery in the United States, whatever else it was pronatalist, dependent upon the biological reproduction of enslaved women for its social reproduction. Slavery advanced along a frontier of accumulated medical, quote, knowledge about black women's bodies, their sexuality, and their reproduction, as well as an array of crass and violent folk practices encoded in the enslaving usage of the word breeder to describe enslaved women of childbearing age, especially in the slave exporting states of the Upper South. The specific character of 19th century American blood libel differed in the emerging states of the Midwest, where the institution of slavery was seen by many poor and working class white people to be a barrier to their own social advancement. Their attitudes toward free people of color were more frequently characterized by an emphasis on racial removal or even elimination than on reproductive control. There was no room at all for black people in the white man's country of the West, according to many of its most ardent exponents. Correspondingly, while the governing stereotypes, including those that appeared under the color of medical science, of enslaved African Americans emphasized their phlegmatic indolence, Negrophobia in the 19th century Midwest was framed around the idea that free people of color were overeager workers who undercut the market for white labor. The racism of the 19th century was, that is to say, shaped in dialectical relation with the varied material circumstances of capitalist development in different places. Racism was made, as Patrick Wolfe wrote, in the targeting. Wolfe's classic article, Land, Labor, and Difference, tracks the different patterns of racialization that characterize slavery and settler colonialism in the Americas. God did not direct his chosen people to exterminate all races. Such as were fit for slavery, they were ordered to make slaves of, wrote the pro-slavery social theorist George Fitzhugh. Slavery, the condition of being heritable property, brought forth and depended upon comparatively strict racial regulation, the management and commodification of black blood. Under the so-called one-drop rule, which was really a state-by-state patchwork of different degrees of legal exposure based upon the summoning of imaginary portions of black and white blood, people whose African ancestry was multiple generations in the past were nevertheless harnessed to the maintenance and reproduction of the enslaving class over time. Their blood was cantoned and parsed out of the dominant stock. Indians, Wolfe shows, were generally racialized differently. In contrast to the indelible taint of the one-drop rule, the imperialists of North America imagined a future in which Indians would simply disappear. However, our present interests may restrain us within our own limits. It is impossible not to look forward to distant times when our rapid multiplication will expand itself beyond those limits and cover the whole northern, if not the southern continent, with a people speaking the same language, governed in similar forms and by similar laws. Nor can we contemplate with satisfaction either blot or mixture on that surface. Writing in 1801, Thomas Jefferson forecast much of the history of the 19th century. Christianity would replace native religion. Indians' domestic economy, internal politics, and kinship structures would be reorganized in accordance with Anglo-American gender norms. Forced adoption and Indian schools would re-educate children into, quote, civilization. Citizenship would replace sovereignty as the idiom of governance. Removal, reservations, and allotment would distinguish common holdings. Settler militias and the United States Army would kill anyone who refused to disappear into all of the above. The distinct accounts of racial difference that determined African American and Native American humanity in the 19th century insistently press up against and deconstruct the notion of race itself. They direct our attention to what Barbara and Karen Fields term racecraft, the process by which ancestry is built into social meaning. Cedric Robinson characterized the initial phase of the dialectic of economic development and racial specification this way. The creation of the Negro was obviously at the cost of immense expenditure of psychic and intellectual energies in the West. The exercise was obligatory. It was an effort commensurate with the importance black labor power possessed for the world economy, sculpted and dominated by the ruling and mercantile classes of Western Europe. Much of the intellectual history of the West, Robinson was suggesting, should be understood as an unceasing effort to naturalize existing economic relations, even while underwriting future speculations, patrolling and pushing outward toward the frontier of racial accumulation. There is no document of civilization which is not, at the same time, a document of barbarism, Walter Benjamin wrote. While racialization always has the effect of degrading humanity, it is not always derogatory in the superficial sense. It is related to, although not identical with, racial discrimination. Racial capitalism has always twinned the valorization and overdevelopment of particular features of the darker peoples of the world with their individual and collective degradation. David Roediger and Elizabeth Esch's The Production of Difference provides a catalog of the isolation and elevation of specific human capacities into characteristics supposedly definitive of entire racialized groups. The thickening of ancestry into a heritable capacity for certain sorts of labor served as both a justification for imperialism and capitalist accumulation and a managerial tool in defining the racial pattern of human instrumentalization. The idea that Africans and African Americans were constitutionally suited for hard work in tropical climates in a way that white people were not, for example, or the appreciable irony of the determination that Chinese laborers, whose own supposed racial history included the invention of gunpowder and the building of the Great Wall, were not racially suited for demolition and stonemasonry in the building of the Central Pacific Railroad, or the innate capacity of, quote, stocky, muscle-bound, cheery, law-abiding Spaniards for digging the Panama Canal, and so on. The supposed racial differences laminated to the skins of the various workers of the world serve not only to provide the terms, excuse me, the terms by which their subordination could be warranted and managed, but as a way of pitting them against one another. The scheme of Europe was no sudden invention, Du Bois wrote in his indispensable essay, The Souls of White Folk. Excuse me, you're just going to have to hold on for 1 second. Sorry. The scheme of Europe was no sudden invention, Du Bois wrote in his indispensable essay, The Souls of White Folk, but a way out of long pressing difficulties. It is plain to modern white civilization that the subjection of the white working classes cannot much longer be maintained. The day of the very rich is drawing to a close. But there is a loophole. There is a chance for exploitation on an immense scale for inordinate profit, not simply to the very rich, but to the middle class and the laborers. This chance lies in the exploitation of the darker peoples. Racial capitalism, Du Bois was arguing, came in the form of a fix, a way to resolve class antagonism between whites into an illusory sense of shared superiority. Du Bois continued this story in Black Reconstruction, his historical account of the way that the white working people in the South were beguiled by the psychological wage of whiteness, failing to recognize 4 million newly emancipated people as workers like themselves. They entered instead into political alliances with the ruling class that foreclosed the revolutionary possibilities of abolition democracy in the aftermath of the Civil War. Both the variety and the specificity of the racist disfiguration described above, exaggerating on the one hand and diminishing on the other, suggest the importance of a clear accounting of the moments of racialization, of the specific targetings in which racial domination and economic accumulation have been annealed into shared form. The work of the British sociologists Gurminder K. Mambra and Fiona Williams has recently pointed attention to the analytical benefit of distinguishing carefully between extraction, exploitation, expropriation, and expulsion as pathways of accumulation. In the American context, as in the Australian, it is sadly necessary to add elimination. These should not be thought of as pure forms. One rarely occurs in isolation from one or two others, and yet employed as tools to give shape to our thought, they can help us summon a version of history attentive to change, to the changes in the way that value has been drawn out along the vascular pathways of racial capitalism. In his essay of Work and Wealth, which I have already quoted above, Du Bois analyzed the East St. Louis massacre of 1917 as an episode in the history of racial capitalism. Of Work and Wealth is a weirdly and beautifully lyrical essay. It seems desperately and arguably unsuccessfully to reach for an understanding of the unspeakable cruelty of the massacre, of a teenage messenger boy shot down in the street and his bicycle thrown over the hedge into a neighbor's yard, of old women driven from their houses by gangs that set fire to their back porches and then shot them as they ran out the front, of white working people pillaging their black neighbors' homes and walking out into the mayhem carrying their possessions and wearing their clothes. It confronts the carnal excess of race hatred, the aspect of racial capitalism which no notion of economic instrumentality or formal functionalism can explain. And yet, Du Bois places the massacre in a very specific economic context, the context of Black migration from the South, wartime industrial production in the Midwest, the entitlement of white labor, and the racial segmentation of the labor force as a mode of management. The compact between capital and labor and white labor in East St. Louis rested upon their shared commitment to a dual labor market, in which African Americans were excluded from both labor unions and any but the most menial jobs in the city's plants and slaughterhouses. The First World War, however, transformed the material circumstances that had made that bargain make sense. For the owners and managers, increased demand for their products, canned meats, artillery shell cases, gunpowder, offered the opportunity for almost endless profit-taking through increased production. For the unions and the white workers, and truly, we must think of whitening workers because many of them were of German origin and thus themselves suspect in a time of war. It offered the opportunity to renegotiate the terms of their labor by threatening to withhold it. When the line workers at the aluminum ore plant went on strike in the summer of 1917, the bosses replaced them with black workers, ununionized migrants from the South previously excluded from the plants. For the bosses, these workers represented a sort of standing reserve, a pool of labor from which they could draw credibility with Jim Crow unions by excluding from the production line in times of relative calm, and from which they could draw replacement workers during times of labor conflict. For the unionized white workers, these workers represented a threat to, quote, their jobs, which is to say a tremendous failure to come to terms with the notion of black workers as a part of the brotherhood of labor. The conflagration began as a contest over the terms of work in factories, as a conflict over labor and exploitation, and grew quickly into an attack on the very possibility of black life in East St. Louis, on black homes, black women, and on the possibility of a black future. It flared into eliminationism and resulted in expulsion. In the aftermath of the violence, as many as 5,000 African Americans are estimated to have fled across the Mississippi River to St. Louis, Missouri. Much of that city's history in the centuries since can be imagined as an arc of successive racial capitalist removals. From the areas on the riverfront and westward along Mill Creek Valley, where the refugees from East St. Louis settled along with migrants from Mississippi. From the Pruitt-Igoe housing complex, which lay to the north and the west of Mill Creek Valley, to working class suburbs like Kinloch, Jennings, and Ferguson, which lay still further to the north and west. And finally, outward from the metropolitan areas of the archipelago to the archipelago of prisons in majority white towns and small cities across the state. Each of these settlements and each of these removals was characterized by a dominant mode of capitalist accumulation. Mill Creek Valley by rent farming in its segregated real estate market when it stood, and by the expropriation of black property and a set of extractive transfers to whites when it was torn down, to the white workers who destroyed it and covered its history over with interstate highways, to the white suburbanites who used those highways to travel to all-white suburbs whose settlement had been subsidized by federal loan guarantees, to the Depression-era enlistees in federal jobs programs who had first targeted the neighborhoods on the grounds that they absorbed more state expenditure in services than they provided in taxes. Pruitt-Igoe, where many of those who had been driven from Mill Creek Valley ended up, was colonized and controlled according to a different set of economic interests and imperatives, those of the University Defense Research Industrial Complex. Pruitt-Igoe became a living laboratory, a sort of reserve for the production of knowledge serving both the growing prominence of Washington University and the imperatives. Washington University is a private university in St. Louis. Of Washington University and the imperatives of Cold War-era weapons research. By the mid-1960s, there were more sociologists than maintenance workers employed in the vast project, which was made up of 30 11-story buildings. It was the largest housing project in the world. And the Army Chemical Corps was conducting experiments with airborne weapons containing hazardous radioactive elements. In 1972, the complex, which had once housed 15,000 people, was demolished by the federal government, the opening act in the process of deliberate abandonment that continues to this day. The Ferguson Uprising in 2014 drew national attention to the extractive economy that had grown up around the black population of North County municipalities like Ferguson. Like so many others in the era of post-industrial outsourcing and offshoring, many of the residents of North County have been rendered surplus from the standpoint of industrial employment. Their bare efforts to keep living, rather than their exploitation as providers of cheap labor, has become the focus of a seemingly final round of extraction, one symbolized by the CSL Plasma Donation Center at the city's northern boundary, where impoverished Missourians literally sell their blood in order to get enough money to go on living. In our moment in the history of racial capitalist extraction, in our moment of the history of racial capitalism, extraction seemingly bleeds into practices of expulsion and even elimination. Plasma harvesting, usurious payday loans, for-profit policing, and mass incarceration. The conversion of the poor, the unable, the unwilling, and the abandoned in and of themselves into tax revenue and income, into revenue streams that provide small collectives of white investors with outrageous returns on small loans, while drowning the poor in debts that they have taken on to cover daily expenses, into traffic tickets that subsidize city budgets that are largely devoted to the salaries and armament of white police officers who commute in from distant suburbs, into taxes assessed on the citizens of cities in order to provide their governments with enough money to cover payouts for the wrongful death suits for which they budget in the same way that they budget the purchase of sand and salt for the roads in advance of a winter storm. Into prisoners who fill the jails, whose construction, provisioning, supervision, and maintenance functioned as a primary mode of state-supported economic development in the majority white areas of rural Missouri. In the shadow of the prison house, there is one final problem that an analysis of racial capitalism needs to deal with, one emblematized by the police murder of Dylan Noble in June of 2016. Like so many others, Noble was unarmed when he was shot by police in the parking lot of a Chevron station in Fresno, California. Unlike so many others, he was white. In the aftermath of his murder, his friends protested at the gas station where he had died, some carrying signs that read, "White Lives Matter," a slogan that seemed to unwittingly reproduce the racial order of our society, even as it reached toward an understanding of the evident similarity between the death of Dylan Noble and that of, say, Michael Brown. Justice Medina, the young black man who had organized the vigil, pointed the way forward when he noted that while he was troubled by the display of a Confederate flag at the vigil, he was more focused on the way that Noble's death resembled the deaths of others shot by the police than how it differed from them. He didn't have a gun in his hand, but they put bullets in him, and then they hit him with a shotgun, Medina said. Of whiteness, he said, it shows to the richer side of Fresno that this is possible to happen to you. Medina's focus on the weapons carried by the police and the promiscuity of their usage draws our attention to the way that Noble's death, like the sadistic police murder of Daniel Shaver in the hallway of a La Quinta Inn in Mesa, Arizona earlier in 2016, like so many other deaths of poor and working-class white people at the hands of the police, was framed by the political economy of racial capitalism. The politics by which the racialized fears of white property owners have been conscripted to the militarization and radicalization of police officers who are then turned loose upon the population as a whole. The order of argument here is essential. I am drawing on the insight of M.A. Césaire, who argued that the techniques and moral degeneracy so evident in the European history of fascism and genocide in the middle of the 20th century had been pioneered and perfected in the colonies over the preceding 3 centuries of slavery and settler colonialism, and that of K.Sue Park, who has demonstrated in detail how commercial instruments designed to effect the imperial expropriation of Native Americans were soon put to work in dispossessing poor whites as well. And from Achille Mbembe's notion of blackification, the idea that the history of our century will be framed by the lowering of the vast majority of humankind to the conditions that have been singularly inflicted upon Africa and its descendants over the course of modernity. In memory of Dylan Noble, and according to the political and moral vision of Justice Medina, we need to begin to think of the violence of capitalism in general, towards poor and working class white people as well as black people, toward the veterans of imperial wars as well as their victims, towards everyone who lives near a waste dump or breathes polluted air or faces the onrushing planetary catastrophe, which is to say, in the final instance, all of us, as bearing the historical imprint of practices that were originally justified and pioneered in empire, in racial capitalism. The exploitation of the white working class, itself an analytical formation that tacitly acknowledges the racial stipulation of class and capitalism in our society, is itself an unfolding of the history that began with the slave trade, but it is one that cannot be addressed by ignoring the specificity of that historical pathway, only by confronting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. That was really, really fascinating, really wide-ranging lecture. You really gave us a framework for understanding, not just U.S. history, but history more broadly, and even the world that we live in now. So I think it's really, really a broad framework. It was so helpful. We have time for some questions and discussions. So if you want to use the raise hand function, or type them in the chat. We've got a question already in the chat from Claire Suzanne. In what ways have these intertwined forces contributed to the transmission of trauma across generations? And how might this affect our understanding of the long-term social and psychological impacts of racial capitalism?
I think that's a terrific question. Du Bois refers to, at some point, he refers to the condition of enslavement as having inspired a pattern of thought and action. And I think that we can think about that in a number of ways. One way to think about it is the way that Cedric Robinson thinks about it, which is he refers to the Black radical tradition as ontological, as something that has become real. And he's not trying to invoke an essentialist or a culturalist notion of the Black radical tradition, but he's rather trying to talk about a set of ideas and practices that have been structured in dominance and then are carried forward. And so I think it's probably there that I would want to begin. I do think, and this is not something that I know a lot about, but I think that there are people now who talk about it, think about epigenetics and the way that trauma processed as stress through an individual body is passed on, is heritable. And that would have to do with so the tremendous amounts of stress produced cortisol that people are living with in the kind of the daily stress of racial capitalism. So I think that is, to me, again, it's not something that I am terrific at thinking about. It's not the kinds of things I usually think about, but it's a really productive question and kind of an avenue for investigation. I have thought, quite a bit about Du Bois' notion of the patterns. He actually refers to it as a philosophy of action, the philosophy and life of life and action of the enslaved, and that, to me, I think, is trying to get at exactly what the question is trying to get at, which is sort of the depth, the material character of consciousness, of resistance and of suffering in slavery and other cognate institution structures.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great question, Claire. Got a question from Eve. Could you comment on how you see these ideas being applicable or not to the genocide in Gaza?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, and I think, well, and I don't know if you read the newspaper today, you see the beginnings of a program of removal and real estate speculation are being reported in the Israeli press, as yet denied as a goal of the government, and yet supported by some of its ministers who were present at a conference at the edge of Gaza. And so I think there is that. I think that there is I think there's the feeding through on the part of the United States, in particular, of government grants, U.S. government grants, to Israel that are then poured back into the defense industry in the United States. There's the enormous elaboration of a defense and security apparatus based on public and private cooperation in Israel. And I think there is at the bottom of it a set of speculations and aspirations around dispossession and a land grab. So I think that there are identifiable capitalist aspects to the apartheid, to the war, and to what the International Court of Justice has, as I'm sure you all know, characterized as a genocide. That said, there's also, I think, an aspect of the struggle on both sides, really, that is in excess of that kind of instrumental purpose. And I think that's, the character of human beings in conflict that has been just grotesquely amplified in this conflict. I mean, particularly, the reporting in the New York Times about the number of small children coming into hospitals in Gaza with bullets in their skulls. I think that speaks to part of what I'm trying to get at about the excessive character of racial and imperial violence in relationship to any imaginable instrumental purpose.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a question from Martina. How has the role of unions in the US changed more recently in recognizing and responding to the racialization of labor extraction?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And that is one that I have the beginnings of an answer to, but not a full answer. So, there's several ways to go about it. The first way to go about it would be to note that there are various unions which have been very responsive and other unions which have not. The building trades in the United States are notoriously segregated and white dominated, and that's one of the things that I was trying to get at when I was talking about the notion of a tremendous infrastructural program, as which was a proposal of one of the Sanders campaigns, as a kind of a notion, as a motor of economic growth and employment. That's pouring, $20 billion or whatever was going to be poured into a segregating transportation network and to segregated unions, building trades unions. So that will be a problematic example. Other unions, SEIU as an example, I think have done, as far as I understand it, terrific work in trying to help workers, white people in general, Americans, to understand immigrant labor, the descendants of immigrant laborers as working people, and to organize them. All of that faces the problem, and this is where I become, I think, probably a little bit aspirational for a lot of people. All of that faces the problem of the idea of the United States as a container of an economy and a container of our moral concerns, right? And so, for me, one of I try in my own moral and ethical thinking not to allow my own moral and ethical thinking to be contained by the border. And which is, of course, the border is a reminder of violence and of the very processes that we're talking about. And so I think that in my utopian imagination, we would live in a world where labor organizing and solidarity and opposition to capitalist exploitation were not subjected to to national identity or to the electoral politics of the various nations.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question from Jack Lewis. Does the global system founded on bonded labor, as documented in the work of Siddhartha Kara and many others, founded on capitalist contract of indebtedness, a historical analog to the racialized capitalism you describe?
I think so. I mean, I'm always reluctant to be, because my arguments are generally focused on specificity. I'm always reluctant to kind of generalize out to histories about which I know not enough to be credible. So, I know a fair amount about the history of Europe, Africa, and the Americas, and I think it is fair to say that European civilization was generated out of slavery. I just, out of slavery and imperial dispossession. I think that's a basic, I can start with that. It seems to me, from what I know of the rest of the world, to be, I think we could generalize my argument outward, but I'm not perhaps the person to do it. I'm just trying to overcome my own provincialism on a daily basis.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There's another question, Yifan. If I understand correctly, you use the logic of the broken plate to suggest capitalism repetitively targets the group who are the victims of earlier stages of capital accumulation. Could you further explain what drives or maintains this historical continuity, or why there is this path dependency?
Yeah, I like what the description that William Conroy gives it as a line of tendential force, as a sort of a tear in the fabric of time that then allows for a kind of a repetition of targeting. And the reason I'm interested in that is because of a set of arguments about the character of historical time. So there's a lot of I think the frustration of a lot of what I'll call the class forward, more kind of classically Marxist critics of the idea of racial capitalism, or the idea of racism as a principle of historical analysis, is that it seems to be them to be changeless, right? It seems to them to be an argument that, well, so one thing that drives people crazy is the notion of racism as the original sin of American history. And it drives them insane because that's a timeless notion. It's a metaphysical notion. How can you argue that this one thing happened in 1619 or whatever, and it endures through all of American history? And yet, we need to reckon with the fact that through all of the economic and political change in the history of the United States, it's basically always been the same people on the bottom. There is a repetition. For me, however, I want to try to figure out an argument that is dynamic, is economically and temporally dynamic, that on the one hand can figure out this repetition, and on the other hand can speak with some kind of specificity to historical and economic and material change. And so that's what I'm trying to do with the end of the paper, where I talk about these 5 different modes of accumulation, is to say, well, what happens if we try to think very, very specifically about these things in different times and different places? And yet, at the same time, how do we understand the repetition? How do we understand the repeated targeting of certain populations, of certain parts of the globe? And that's where the logic, where Du Bois' notion of the logic of the broken plate helped me see, how once those pathways are incised into the face of the globe, once those pathways are incised in history, it's easier to go back and instrumentalize the same people, the descendants,
Thank you. There's a question from Julie McIntyre about land ownership. Could you say something more about your thinking on the relationship between racialization and land ownership?
Yeah, okay. So this is something that question helps me understand. I need to make much clearer. One of the very, very basic, and this is really coming out of Patrick Wolf, one of the basic points that this paper should be making, and I now realize it has understated, is that settler colonialism has a tendency within it towards elimination. And it has a tendency within it towards elimination because of the notion of land ownership of fee simple land holding as the foundation of freedom. And so what I'm trying to do in the part of the paper that I think is maybe got a little bit foggy, is I'm trying to contrast, among other things, the racialization of African Americans, which in slavery is pronatalist, is dependent upon biological reproduction, right? With the racialization of Native Americans in the very same place at the very same time, which is eliminationist. And that has to do, in Wolf's kind of classic formulation, with the different patterns of racialization spurred by the exploitation of labor as opposed to the expropriation of land. And so again, that would be a perfect example of how I'm trying to point it at differing modes of accumulation and how they are dialectically related to differing characterizations of difference. And I honestly think as I sit here right now thinking about what I've just read to you in light of that question, I think I got a little bit too carried away in trying to be faithful to Wolf's comparatively complex argument and missed what is, for me, the sort of essential thing that I'm trying to take away from it. So I really appreciate that.
There's a question from Claire. Have you applied these ideas to Australia at all? Or have you worked with any Australian historians?
I have not. I mean, apart from Patrick Wolf, who I knew and learned from. He was a fellow at the Warren Center here. It must be 15 years ago now. So I have thought in concert with him, but not so much beyond that. I'm certainly not averse to being in conversation with and learning from other people. So that it'd be fun. Definitely be in touch if you have ideas.
Well, Patrick Wolf was here at La Trobe for many years, so
I know I looked that up.
Yeah, it's nice that you drew on his work like that.
I mean, honestly, I should have remembered him at the beginning, because he was a terrific intellectual and a generous and humane and goofy person. He was fun to be around, and he is missed as well as I think somebody who had profound and searing things to say about Palestine.
Yeah, absolutely. And his work is very widely cited, as your lecture illustrated. It really illustrates that, the ongoing impact of his ideas,
Absolutely.
and particularly as a theorist.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I had a question I wanted to ask about how is this argument received in the US, because there's this sort of conservative argument that part of the job of history is to produce patriotism and to build citizenship. And, some states have banned race theory, haven't they? The teaching of race theory,
Yeah.
Florida. So, how do you just tell us about that?
I mean, I'll be completely honest with you. Right now, all bets are off. I mean, the moment is very disorienting here. And I guess that it's in a way, I suppose I say that, and I say that from a particular position, which is as somebody who teaches in a private university in Massachusetts. And so I haven't faced the kind of surveillance and repudiation by my employer that a lot of my colleagues have who work at state universities across the nation. But after last year at Harvard and in American universities generally, it's hard to know what sorts of things are going to be supported and protected by universities. So, I kind of am just going on what I've always done. I mean, I'm not gonna stop saying the things that I have been thinking about and saying for a long time. But I do think that they are certainly less likely to be institutionally celebrated than they were in the past, and they're more likely to be aggressively misunderstood. And I think that's a little bit, that's that piece is a little bit uncertain. Obviously those, those who speak out about Palestine are, I think, the primary people being targeted. At this point, there is certainly a kind of effort to broaden that targeting into set of attacks on Marxists or critical race theory. I mean, as if any of these people know what critical race theory is. Critical race theory is this incredibly recondite body of legal thought that, I'm not even I've read that much critical race theory. It's like really, 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 and sort of obscure stuff. So yeah, that's all there. It's there.
Yeah, and just building on that, I mean, how optimistic or pessimistic are you about the future of race and racism in the US?
I think we're under siege in a way. I think that if you what used to seem what I literally remember in the middle of the 1990s as a kind of a program being advanced by David Duke in Louisiana about they would go around T-shirts and a WP, the National Association for the Advancement of White People, and the idea that somehow there was a organized governmental and cultural effort to target white people. I think that kind of thinking has now actually been embraced by the United States Supreme Court in the decision to do away with affirmative action in university admissions. So the idea there is that is discriminatory against white people. And so what's happened is a kind of the notion of colorblind liberalism has been turned inside out. And colorblind liberalism, which was a weak reed for justice to lean on in the first place, has now become fully inverted and is being employed as a mode of racial governance and exclusivity, and perhaps dispossession. So, and I don't see, I don't actually see either of the political parties as being as concerned with that as they might. And to be honest, I think that the Democratic Party has absolutely utterly failed to seize the moment that they should have seized, and to make to present a significant and consequential answer to the problem of precarity and inequality in our society, as experienced by all people, including many white people. And so that's part of what I'm trying to imagine at the end is how is it that one can make a radical argument that supports addressing the legitimate sense of inequality and precarity that so many of the white people who are supporting Trump feel. I think the Democratic Party has failed at that, and I fear, we'll see what happens in the election. But even this election, just like the election of Biden, is say that Harris wins, it's simply pushing the moment of a kind of a Trumpian reaction down the road to as long as the Democratic Party fails to address the precarity and inequality in our society, that reaction, that kind of Christian white nationalist aggrieved reaction is going to be there in a kind of a potential form. And so, in a way, I think that the Democratic Party's alliance with Wall Street is not the antidote to Trumpism, it's the cause. And, I literally pray to God that they can figure that out, in time to save us all from what seems increasingly likely to be our future.
Right, thank you. I think it's probably a good note to end on. But has anyone got any other question? Final question? Katie, yeah.
I think you're muted, Katie.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Walter. That was just fascinating and very powerful as well. I was trying to figure out how to word this question, but at the beginning you talked about, suggestion that, is genuine civility even possible vis-a-vis, DEI? And I take your point about that. But given the kind of violence that you have articulated and the excessive violence of capitalism and empire, and the very bleak sort of portrait that you've painted just in your comments just then, I sort of wonder whether civility is all that we have left, whether at least that's something we can cling to.
No, that's legit. And so what I'm trying to argue against there is the way that I think in universities civility came to stand for and replace a kind of a deeper reckoning with inequality. That whole question has become enormously complicated in a way that this paper doesn't go into in the United States, with the idea of civility as a term that is being deployed to silence protest. And so there's a whole, so that's also there and makes that term more complicated. All of that said, I accept and actually really, really believe in what you said. And I imagine it this way. I imagine that what we need to do in institutions is to behave ourselves in a way that reflects a better future. And so while I reject an institutional requirement of civility, I actually try to embody and to kind of model a deeper kind of notion of commonality. And I 100% agree with your notion of it may be all we have left. Because what I hear you saying is like, look, we're losing. And our institutions are corrupt. And so what we need to then do is to find ways of relating to one another that are not defined by that situation. That's why I hear in your question. And I believe that profoundly. So, one thing that I didn't really, this is part of a little intellectual journey that I'm on, that has taken me more into smaller scales of analysis and imagination, less on the notion, less on a kind of a notion of the seizure of state power, and much more on a kind of a smaller scale anarchist kind of notion of mutual aid. And I think that is essential. And I think that's, almost necessarily a way forward for us. And so that then would lead me out into a body of thought about abolition and, different things like that, prison abolition, police abolition, creating the sort of circumstances in and of ourselves where we can care for one another.
Thanks. Fabulous answer. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Walter. I think from the comments I can see that you've really given us a lot to think about. Very illuminating talk, very thought-provoking. I think your talk really gets to the heart of one of the things that I really like about history, that we deal with the confronting aspects of humanity, and look inside human agency and ask those hard questions. And you haven't sort of shied away from doing that. So I think it really is an important task and gives us a lot to reflect on. So we should think about that and let you go now. I know it's the evening there in Boston, so should let you have a rest. And
That's my bedtime. I'm past my bedtime.
Thank you.
I would just like it to be recorded for the record that I made it through without making any kind of joke about it being Monday here and Tuesday there. I mean, the temptation was enormous. And then I thought, man, y'all have probably heard that joke 7,000 times. And so I let it go up until now.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate it. I really appreciate being with you all.
Thank you. We appreciate it too. And hope you have a great night.